The SD Ruby podcast is brought to you by New Relic.
Let's get started. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm Ben Hughes, and I'm going to talk today about some of the new features in Rails 4. Keep in mind that everything I'm talking about right now is subject to change, and Rails 4 is not in beta or pre-release yet, so just keep that in mind. I think there's a lot of useful stuff to know about. I'm also going to go over a little bit how to get your Rails 3 apps prepared for Rails 4. There's some gems you can actually install for Rails 3 to start transitioning to Rails 4 before it's out. But first, let's talk about the evolution of Rails over the versions. So after Rails 1, we had Rails 2, and that was all about REST, a new way to architect our applications. It's a pretty big release, big changes there. Rails 3 was a lot about modularization, especially back-end refactoring. Of course, you had the merging with MERD, and then also as of 3.1, the ACID pipeline, which is still controversial today. Rails 4 so far I see as more of a closet cleaning release, so nothing super major about this, but a lot of kind of tiny features bundled into one, and kind of getting rid of some of the old best practices that we used to think were good, but no longer are good. So this is the image you'll see if you go to, there's actually a 4.0 release notes on Rails guides. This kind of categorizes some of the changes. And we'll be talking about the majority of these, not quite all of them. In fact, a couple of them have already been pulled from the master branch. They're no longer applicable for 4.0 release. Okay, so the first thing is that it's going to require 1.9.3. You can't even run 1.9.2. If you look at the Rails source code itself, a lot of it's been sort of converted to the new 1.9 syntax used for hashes and lambdas and so on. So you need to be on 1.9.3. I think probably the most important feature of Rails 4 is strong parameters. There's been a debate in the community about how to handle form parameters coming in to controllers. There's been some very public security issues, like the GitHub issue, I think about a year ago, with people posting in parameters that were not expected, nevertheless would get created or updated with the form. So in Rails 3, we kind of solved this problem, and even before Rails 3, by basically whitelisting attributes at the model level. So we use @accessible, like in this example on person, to say, okay, we're going to allow name and age, and that's it, to come in to the active record methods. But this approach has some limitations. It's not very powerful because you're only giving it single keys. For example, you can't really control nested keys, like if you're using nested attributes very well. The other problem is that it's not very context aware. So you might have an admin people's controller, and that might want to accept different attributes. And so the new approach with Rails 4, after a lot of discussion, is basically controlling your params at the controller level. There are a couple plugins out there for doing this now in Rails 3, but the new way going forward is this approach to strong parameters. And basically the idiom will be to define a method on your controller, or really kind of however you want to do it, but basically only expose the parameters that you explicitly permit to your models. So in this example, we have person params, and then we're saying params that require person. That's a way to say, okay, we need this parameter. If it's not there, that's a problem. And then .permit will explicitly permit those attributes going forward. So this approach requires that you be more cognizant of what's going on in your controller. You can't really rely on just the defaults and just you add a column somewhere and everything just works. So you have to be aware of this. And the API for this in Rails 4 is a lot more powerful than just a simple example. You can do nested, like nested attributes. You can give it a set of nested hashes. You can even specify the type that's to be expected. But you can actually use this in Rails 3 today. So if you want to get your app prepared, you want to start moving towards this new approach of doing this at the controller level, there's a gem out there called strong parameters. And the README on that, by the way, is very good. So even for learning about it for Rails 4, you can check that out. Okay, Rails 4 is going to be thread safe by default. We have had sort of thread safety in Rails for a while now, but it's been turned off. And you have to explicitly turn it on. So by default now, Rails 4 is thread safe. that has some implications both from the framework, which have already been dealt with, which is requiring code up front. So boot time might actually be a little bit longer because it has to, requiring isn't thread safe, so they've got to require all the code before they start accepting requests. But more importantly for your code, you need to make sure that your code is thread safe if you're going to leave it this way. And also all gems being thread safe. If not, you can disable thread safety basically by using the middleware rack lock, which it's just a middleware that locks a request around, creates a lock around the entire request, only one request goes through. So that's no longer there by default Rails 4. One implication of this is live streaming. This is a feature that Aaron Patterson gave a talk on at a couple conferences. But it's pretty cool. Basically, by default, controllers will buffer. That's what they do now. They buffer the output, and then they send it along to the client. But if you include this module, Action Controller Live, basically that says the actions in this controller are streamable in the sense that this method is going to be invoked in a thread, and you get access to this object called response.stream. And that allows you to operate with that stream, like an I/O object, and basically stream stuff down to the client. And the use case for this is potentially using something like server-side events, where the client maintains a connection to the server that is open, and then the server can basically push down events to the client and have it invoke JavaScript code. If you're interested in this, you should really check out Aaron's talk, because he actually builds a prototype of, he has a basically controller action that looks for changes to files, and will send down an event to the client to do a page reload. So you change a view file, save it, and boom, your browser just reloads automatically. But I think there's going to be a lot of implications for this in the future. I think there's some areas where Rails can compete with Node.js much more strongly for live streaming. Okay, so caveats, again, your code must be thread safe, obviously, because it's running the thread. You also need, and this is going to work with all Ruby web servers, you need a Ruby web server that is concurrent. Puma is a popular one. Matt and Eddie talked about Puma here about 6 months ago. We have a podcast, I think, up already for it. And then you also must make sure to write the headers first for obvious reasons, and then you have to really remember to close the stream, because if you don't, it's going to leave that socket open indefinitely. And I have a couple of URLs here with more information. The slides are posted on my website, so don't feel like you have to write this down. You can check the slides out later and go to the URLs. Okay, turbo links. This isn't so much a feature really of Rails, I would say. It's really just a default gem include, kind of like CoffeeScript. That's just a gem include. But I think it will set the stage for development going forward, just like the CoffeeScript thing really, people wanted to use CoffeeScript. Has anyone here used PJAX? It's a similar thing. Yes, this is really similar to PJAX. The main difference is that it's more transparent. But basically the idea is that if you have this gem in here and the JavaScript code is in your JavaScript file, the JavaScript code is going to look for any link on your page that is going to an internal URL. So basically just links within your app, not external links. And it's going to put an event handler on there that will prevent the browser from going to the actual URL, but instead it'll load that URL via Ajax, the whole page. This will work with any GET request. And then it's going to take that response, it's going to look at the title tag and body tag, and it's just going to replace those. Now you might think that's a little strange, but it actually is quite fast. And the reason is that the browser doesn't have to reinterpret and reload any JavaScript or style sheets. It's just replacing the body. And it maintains the URL structure with HTML5 push state, gracefully degrading for older browsers. So if you don't want to use this, you can just remove the gem, remove the includes in your JavaScript file. This is in Rails 4 by default. Small one, before filter. I never liked that name, but we used to call things, filter in the controller. It's been renamed before action, which I think makes more sense. Same thing with after. The old form works. I think it's deprecated though. Okay, for those of you that like Postgres, some great new support Rails 4 for Postgres built in. So there's now Postgres array support, so they're array data type Postgres. There's a syntax fork for creating tables with the column in your migration, and it just works in your active record model. You can set arrays, you can get arrays, and it'll just work with Postgres. There's also support for HStore, which I won't go over, and some new support for new data types like network address and ranges and a couple other things, I think. So great news if you like Postgres. Okay, now some new features with Arrow, and these are kind of exciting, I think. One thing that's always frustrating is if you're doing a where, it's easy to do an equality because you can choose a hash, but to do a not equality, you basically have to use a string. So with Rails 4, now you can just do where.not and then give it a hash. And you notice it also works with the in clause, so you just give it an array. That'll work too. Pretty nice. It's a small little thing on the .first and .last. You may not know this, but this can be problematic with some databases. The reason is that when you call .first, active record is Arrow is generating a query that does select star from table, limit 1 for MySQL, for example, but it doesn't order by anything. So although normally that's the first record by ID, depending on your database, it may not be. And so it's kind of indeterminate. So in Rails 4, unless you're scoping by order explicitly, any other column, it's going to order by ID. So you get it's a little more exact. This is another sort of edge case one, but I have found myself in a situation where I've actually written the code. This is .where string 1 equals 0. And this is useful in cases where you want to return an arrow relation, but you want to ensure that it returns no rows. And you might think you can just return an array. Well, you can't, because that's an array and you can't call further scopes than that. So in this example, if you called out visible scopes, if that was an array, calling out where obviously won't work. So right now in Rails 3, I use where 1 equals 0, which is kind of silly because it's sending that query to the database, even though obviously it's going to return no rows. So in Rails 4, there's a new method called none. And that basically has the same effect, but it's a little more performant because it doesn't send a query anywhere. It's all with an arrow and ensures that anything after that, no matter what you do, it's always going to return an empty set. Basically, any method in Arrow that you're used to using, where, limit, whatever, now has equivalent bang methods. So, whereas before, this is a common idiom in your index action, you're kind of doing a bunch of scopes based on parameters being passed in, and you have to do people equals people.where instead. Now you can do just .where bang. That works for, again, virtually any method in Arrow. I'm sure many of you have probably done just this. Comments is a common one in your routing, where you have sort of this common concern that for sub-resources some kind. In Rails 4, there's now something called concerns in the router. So you can name the concern, and then you can reference that concern in multiple routes. And this is another thing that you can get prepared for if you want, because there's a gem called routing concerns that you can use in Rails 3. So it's one way to prepare your app. Okay, so I said that the Rails 4 release was about a lot of closet cleaning, and as part of this, Rails 4 is going to be extracting out a lot of stuff that's in Rails core into separate gems. So here we have page and action caching will no longer be part of Rails. These will be separate gems you can use if you want by including these gems. The reason is that the core team is starting to move away from page and action caching. Because it's a real challenge to work with that, because you've got to manually expire caches and it's very problem prone. So they're basically recommending to focus more on fragment caching when you can. If not, use some kind of reverse proxy like Varnish if you want, or you can even do caching at the protocol level with e-tags, which has always been available. So again, if you want to use it, if you are using it, you can stay with it and do this. If not, it won't be part of Rails anymore. Related, observers and sweepers are also gone. Sweepers are mostly used with page and action caching, sweeper caches. Those have now been extracted to a gem called Rails observers. Now, observers aren't necessarily caching related, and the core team is recommending people just use simple callbacks on their models. Okay, still on the caching, this is fragment caching here. A new feature with Rails 3 is basically it can do a hash now of your fragment caches. So the problem is this: in Rails 3, if you wanted to do fragment caching, where you are kind of nesting caches, or maybe you're caching a comment, and then those comments are used in a to-do list here. This all works well and fine as long as you make sure you're updated that column. That'll change the cache key and then validate, and everything will just work. The challenge is that if you ever have to change this code after it's already been cached somewhere, it's gonna just use the old version because it doesn't know that anything's changed. And so what a lot of people do now in Rails 3 is they prefix a version number. It's kind of clunky, but it works. So basically every time you update one of these partials, you just increment the version number, and that ensures that it has a different key. You also have to ensure, you have to be aware of dependencies, because if you change the bottom one, comment, that's going to affect the cache above. So you have to remember, if you change my comment, you got to increment that version number and the version number of any dependencies. So again, it's just kind of clunky, it's not ideal. Luckily in Rails 4, they just kind of solve this all transparently, and they do so by hashing. Basically, they're hashing the contents of that block as part of the key. So if you change it, it's going to change the key and you'll be fine. It also is very smart with dependencies. So in this example, if you were to change that bottom one, Rails is aware that it has a dependency on the top one, and it will change the hash of that as well. So the hash is actually a combination of the contents and the hashes of any dependencies. So it's pretty cool. If you're doing fragment caching and run into problems there, it'll be a lot more transparent going forward. Plugins. This has been bad practice for a while. It's finally completely gone. No more vendor plugins. If you want to use the plugin, it's got to be a gem. Another gem extraction is Active Record Session Store. I actually wasn't aware this was still in Rails core, but it is. By default, sessions are stored with the cookie store. But back in Rails 1, I think, the approach was to use Active Record Session Stores, actually storing your sessions in a database. That I guess was still in Rails core, it's now removed. So if you're using that, you have to use this gem. Also, Active Resource, no longer part of Rails, it's just a completely separate gem. So if you're using Active Resource, use this. I do hear that Active Resource is getting a lot of love. So if you've hated it in the past, it's probably going to be getting better. We'll see. Okay, the asset pipeline. A lot of the asset pipeline related code and sprockets has been extracted to sprocket-rails, which is included by default Rails 4 now. But aside from that, there's some new features. Really nice new feature is that sprockets, the asset pipeline will now do differential pre-compilation. So as a Rails 3.1, the challenge is that you can use asset pipeline development, but when you want to pre-compile your assets for deployment, it has to pre-compile all your assets every time. Regardless, if you may have just changed one asset, it's got to recompile all of them. I've run into a lot of problems with this. It's a huge pain. There is, I think, a gem that does this in Rails 3, but in Rails 4, it's built in, it does differential pre-compilation. It will only pre-compile stuff that's actually changed. Real nice. It also gets rid of all those logger statements in your development log, which is a real pain. Every time you look at the development log, it's scroll up. There's a gem called Quiet Assets you can use in Rails 3 if you want to fix that problem in Rails 3. But Rails 4, by default, it will not log asset requests. Okay, scopes are changing. So let's look at the top example for scopes. The active one is perfectly fine. Some of you probably see the problem with the second one though. This is a very common problem people run into, and the problem is that it's very hard to track this down because it's very indeterminate. The problem with the second scope is that your intent is for when you call the recent scope, it to grab time.now. But how it's coded is that time.now will be evaluated in class context. So when that file is loaded, it's going to evaluate time.now. It's not going to be what you want. So the way you can do this now in Rails 3 is you wrap it around a callable, like a lambda. You give it a lambda, and then you put the whatever scope you have inside it. That's fine, it'll work, but Rails doesn't force that on you. In Rails 4, they're forcing it on you. So in Rails 4, all scopes must have callables. You're trying to short circuit a lot of these problems people run into. And with the new 1.9 syntax, it's you can use the little stabby lambda, and it doesn't look a whole lot different. all those dynamic finders that we've had since Rails 1, which I've always hated, are finally gone. So you can't do find by and then some dynamic string with ands and whatever. Those are gone. The implementation for that has always been a mess too, with the method missing. So you have to use arrow now. And in each of those examples, the Rails 4 example, I put Rails 4 there because it's required in Rails 4, but all of those currently work with Rails 3. So if you want to prepare your app ahead of time, I would recommend just going in and converting any of those dynamic finders to the new syntax. And then you can be all set for Rails 4. Okay, so similar thing with hash finders, using .all or .scoped with a hash of conditions, count, limit, whatever else. That's been deprecated. They're trying to encourage you to use the arrow syntax, which is much cleaner, much more concise anyways. If for some reason you really want to use hash finders, you can include this gem, active record deprecated finders, that will hold you over to converting it. Okay, this is kind of a minor one. Patch, not put. So as you know, the update actions are now routed to put. It's a put in HTTP. It's just kind of pedantic, but technically speaking, the RFC defines patch as being a partial update, which is what most people are using update for. So Rails core team has decided to migrate from put to patch. So now your routes will be routed to, for update will be routed to patch, and all the form helpers will emit patch instead of put. This should be fairly transparent to you if you're just using the form helpers. But if you're doing anything where you're manually setting like that underscore method to put, just be aware of this. I believe that put will still work. It will just throw a deprecation warning. I'm not entirely sure on that though. Okay, so that's about it for the new features. I wanted to throw this slide in here. If you want to play around with Rails 4 now, again, there is no beta or pre-release out, so there is no gem published to Ruby gems. You can play with Rails Edge, basically just clone down the repository, go into the directory, do a bundle install. It'll make sure you get all the gems that are required to run the Rails new command. And then basically, instead of just running Rails new, which you'll use whatever's in your current environment, you're going to manually invoke railts/bin/rails. That's your Rails command, new, and then give it an app name. And the one thing you want to just remember is to have the --dev at the end. What that will do is it will ensure that when the app is generated, your gem file will reference your local checkout of Rails, your local Edge Rails checkout. And then go in, you can play around with it. I haven't played around with it too much. I went in and kind of did some scaffolding, see how the scaffolding changed. The scaffolding does generate the new controller form where you have like person params using strong parameters. So if you want to play around with Rails 4, go ahead and check it out. Here's some resources. Again, these slides will be up, so you can just click the URLs from there. The first one in particular is really, really good. So Remarkable Labs put out basically a sequence of articles covering Rails 4, one for each day in December. And I was keeping up each day in December for the articles. Really well written. I think anyone looking to learn more about Rails 4, like go there and read every single article, and you'll have a real solid understanding of this. And then a couple other ones are some other presentations on this topic, which are useful. Also the 4 release notes on Edge guides. I found that those are actually slightly out of date. Like the image I showed you has the queuing API. Some of you might be aware of that. They were going to have a standardized queue, active support queue. That's been pulled. That will not be in Rails 4. It might be in Rails 4.1. And a couple other things that they've pulled. And then a Fresh Cup is a site that kind of keeps track of the commits on Rails Edge. So if you don't want to subscribe to GitHub and see all those commits, this is kind of a more distilled feed of commits going on. And that's it. I can take any questions.
Just had a quick question.
Yeah, that's right.
We're going to use the mic
Yeah.
for questions. Yeah.
First time, so.
the light beyond is working around really.
Yeah.
Okay.
So one of the things that that I've noticed kind of working with TurboLinks that might be beating a dead horse a bit, but there's a lot of plugins out there like the jQuery date picker that aren't really prepared for TurboLinks. And what I mean by that is if you are on a page that uses this date picker and you go to another page and you come back, that date picker widget doesn't actually reinitialize and rebind to that DOM object, and that DOM object no longer exists. So those widgets don't necessarily come up unless you do a full page refresh or you manually reinitialize that date picker. And I want to know if there's anything being done in the version of TurboLinks for Rails 4 that might sort of help address these problems with a lot of these popular widgets.
Yeah, no, I meant to cover that on the slide. There are a lot of caveats to using TurboLinks, and I would recommend seeking out, there's a Cats article, actually this is a Google Plus post where he kind of enumerates a lot of the problems. And like you said, the challenge with TurboLinks is that you're so used to clicking a link and boom, you have a fresh state in JavaScript. With TurboLinks you don't. You're still operating in the same context. So like plugins like date picker, and not just plugins, but even your own code, if you're relying on the document, .ready, that's not going to fire when you click a link anymore. Now, TurboLinks does provide some events that you can listen for. PJAX did this as well. Same problem with PJAX. So basically, with TurboLinks, I think it's cool. I personally would probably say if you're upgrading a Rails 3 app, I personally would not bother with trying to implement TurboLinks. But if you're starting with a fresh app, and as long as you're aware of the caveats and you're willing to work within them and always make sure that number one, any plugin you use is compatible with it, and number two, any code you write is responding to the appropriate events, then it can be very fast. But that's a good point to bring up. There are a lot of caveats with TurboLinks. Again, look at the Cats post.
What's the difference? It's good. You want to hear something. What's the difference between put and patch?
Put and patch. Okay, so basically these are HTTP methods. So you have get and post were the standard ones. But technically there's a whole bunch of methods in HTTP, just not widely used. You also have delete. So before we had get for getting content, post for creating, so it's mapped to create, put for update, delete for destroy. The only thing changing in Rails 4 is that instead of doing put, it's doing patch. A patch is just another HTTP method, but because that RFC technically specifies patch as being a partial update, the Rails core team felt like it was more accurate to use patch. So in other words, they probably should have used that from the beginning, back in Rails 2 when they put it in.
Can you define what you mean by partial update?
Yeah, so basically, my understanding is that the RFC for put means that when you do a put, HTTP put, you always have to define the entire resource, meaning basically every attribute. Like that is technically to the word of the RFC, that's what you should be doing with put. Patch means that you can do partial updates with attributes, which is of course what a lot of people do with update Rails.
Anybody else?
I guess just really quickly, I was just wondering, is there an actual timeline for Rails 4?
Yeah,
I mean, it's always like kind of the crystal ball.
I know, yeah. Not that I've heard of, no. Soon-ish. RailsConf's coming up in end of April, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's end of April. So, sometimes they like to coincide that. I don't know. I mean, it would be sort of along the same timeline. So I'm hoping over the next couple months we should see beta. One thing I also want to say is that, I hinted at this at the beginning, is that I don't think that the upgrade path from Rails 3 to Rails 4 will be very bad. I think it'll be much easier than any of the other major version updates. Again, this is mostly like minor features and sort of closet cleaning, which is good news. It'll be mostly a matter of just all the gems. It's always a problem, is that all the gems have to be potentially updated for Rails 4. Anyone else?
Sorry, just one more quick question. I know with 3, in the later versions of 3, they were really pushing with rolling out mini tests and getting rid of test unit.
Mm-hmm.
And there was some hints that they were going to start picking up the pathway, moving over to having like specs be.
Yeah. Yeah,
because I've even seen a couple commits that were rejected afterwards,
yes,
of like writing specs for Rails, and people.
Yeah, so I don't personally know much about it. The only thing I know is that they've gone back and forth on that. Like they first went to mini test, and then someone converted it to spec, and then I think that's been reverted, and that's still the case. But I wouldn't rely on any of that yet. So that's still subject to change. I don't know much about it though. Anyone else?
This is the last question, and we'll move on. We meet at the bar afterwards and ask the bar.
I was just wondering, quickly, you might be able to elaborate on that live streaming library and like how it kind of compares to Node, like non-blocking I/O and asynchronous call, things like that.
Yeah, so I mean, the challenge right now with Rails is that it's very difficult to just sort of, the thing is that Node has a lot of advantages. And it's not just streaming events, but I think that's where Rails can kind of compete with it on. It's the event streaming. And in particular, that server-side events technology, which is part of HTML5. The technology of just keeping a request open and having the server push down events, I think it's pretty powerful. A lot of apps are starting to do that kind of stuff. And Node's always been very good at that because it's all asynchronous. And now Rails, because it's running a separate thread, and the stream can just be left open, you can just basically have this action running indefinitely in parallel, even within the same process. It's all threaded in parallel to whatever else you have going on, and it can just push down events and keep that stream open. Again, that Aaron Patterson talk is if you want to know more about live streaming, that's a really great talk to look at. Because he does a couple demos of really awesome stuff like that. Auto update, save the page. It checks for FS event. It'll push down the streams. It's all in parallel to other requests that are going on. It's pretty cool. So I think it's nice. It's just the beginning though. I think that there'll be a lot more applicability for that, especially as people start moving towards more client-side heavy applications. So it's nice to see Rails competing in that space now pretty heavily.
We have time for more questions, by the way. I was informed. So, a follow-up on the event streaming.
Mm-hmm.
Does this mean there'll still be a separate thread, a separate Ruby thread for each of the streams of events coming out?
For each stream, yes, but
Okay. So it still makes it difficult if the objective is to compete with Node. Node avoids having an operating system
That's right,
thread,
yeah.
so it's able to scale to a much larger number of most idle connections.
Yeah, well, Node is based on So Node is based on the reactor pattern, so it's reacting completely asynchronously. So that's right. So in Rails, it doesn't use that pattern at all. It's you can do that kind of stuff with the event machine if you want. It's not that Ruby can't do it. The challenge has always been that Ruby libraries don't really fit well with that. So it is thread-based, that's right. But still, I think, until this happened, it was basically impossible to do any sort of streaming performantly. And now at least you can have a thread. I mean, you're not using a reactor loop, but you can at least have a thread that does the streaming all inside.
You mentioned adding bang methods to where.
Mm-hmm.
Does that raise an exception, or?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I probably didn't explain that. The bang method, the only difference between the bang method and non-bang method is the bang method modifies the relation in place. So when you do where on a relation, it doesn't change that relation. It just returns basically a new relation with the modification. So you have to do people equals people.where instead of just people.where. But the bang method will modify the relation in place.
Anybody else? All right.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome talk.